Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Holbrook Travel is pleased to be bringing you this webinar on a very timely topic, Cuba Travel, Understanding the Latest Guidelines. In this webinar, we'll be talking about the current regulations and recent changes to the State Department travel warning system and what they mean from a practical standpoint for travelers who are interested in visiting Cuba. Our special guests today are Andrea Holbrook and Rich Shea. Andrea is the president of Holbrook Travel. She joined the company in 1993 and has been president since 1998. In addition, Andrea manages Selva Verde Lodge and Rainforest Reserve in Costa Rica, and she serves on the boards of the Sarapiquí Conservation Learning Center, Climb for Cancer, and CREST, the Center for Responsible Travel. Holbrook Travel has been offering legal travel programs to Cuba since the year 2000, which has allowed the company to adapt over the years to different changes and guidelines and to develop long-term relationships within the country. We're also joined today by Rich Shea, who is the Director of Communications for the Center for Responsible Travel, or CREST for short. Rich began his career in journalism and worked for 20 years in positions with the Princeton Packet, the New Times of Broward and Palm Beach, and as executive editor of Teacher Magazine. Since 2000, he's focused on helping nonprofits promote their missions and raise funds through marketing materials, annual campaigns, and other outreach. His accomplishments include helping the nonprofit Foundation Fighting Blindness raise $110 million over the course of just 2 years, and he's a frequent traveler himself, having visited 12 countries in just the last 5 years. In our webinar today, Andrea will go over the current guidelines and State Department advisory system. We'll hear from Rich with an overview of the work that CREST is doing, their recent advocacy with the State Department, and key findings from the results of a recent survey. And then Andrea Holbrook will talk a little bit about what you can do to help with some tools to help you, as well as some of our upcoming travel opportunities. And then lastly, we'll wrap up with some time for questions. Please feel free to submit any questions that you have at any point during the webinar, and we'll get to them at the end. And so with that, I'd like to welcome our first guest today, Andrea Holbrook. Welcome, Andrea.
Thank you so very much, Lindsay. That was great introduction, and welcome to everyone that's joining us. I wanted to start today by congratulating all of us ladies that are here on International Women's Day, and also just to thank Rich again for being our co-presenter. I think many of you who are on the call have actually been to Cuba before and or maybe considering going, have either been as participants or as leaders of organizations, and are sort of eager as we are to understand the complexities of the situation in Cuba, with respect to OFAC guidelines and also the travel advisory system. And there's just a lot of change going on. And I joined the CREST board as a board member in the fall, so I'm also really, really pleased with the advocacy work that CREST has been doing. So it's allowed me to connect with industry colleagues and experts in Cuba. So it is really a pleasure to be able to sort of bring the latest and greatest information and share that with all of you who are obviously eager to understand the situation in Cuba. So that being said, I just want to take a brief moment here. Just give me one quick pause. Lindsay, perhaps you can help me here. I am seeing a show my screen button as opposed to the first slide. Is there a reason for that right now?
If you are sharing your screen, if you have the webinar up, you can share the presentation on your screen. Otherwise, I can share it from mine.
Okay, that might be a better idea if you could share it from yours.
Sure.
Okay, great. Wonderful. Okay. Maybe just make it a single slide. Yeah, that'll be great. Wonderful. Thank you. Okay, So essentially, the policy as it stands today, and as I sort of already mentioned to you, cutting through the noise and uncertainty with respect to Cuba is it's a very tangled web. And as long as we've been working in Cuba, there are still things that seem to catch me off guard and things that I'm still learning. So I can understand that it can be confusing. And if any of the jargon that I'm going to use is confusing to you, please absolutely speak up at the end of the webinar and we can kind of discuss it together. One other point here is I want to mention that for those of you that have been to Cuba, which I know are probably many here in the presentation, these changes in regulation have hit Cuba very hard in regulation as well as the travel advisory. So this is a difficult time, and it's hard to see what the people in Cuba, all the paladars and casas particulares and artists and the people who depend on the tourism economy, to really see what, unfortunately, what is going on today. It has hit the country hard, and Rich will also be speaking to that a little bit. So next slide. Basically, the key messages that I want to share with you today is that travel to Cuba is still legal, and it can be done in most of the same ways it was before with some nuances, and that travel to Cuba is very safe. It won the Excelencias Award, which was presented at the International Tourism Fair in Madrid as the safest country for tourism for those that have been there before. I'm sure you would echo my statement in that regard. We'll be talking a little bit more about that safety record with Rich and the survey that the CREST organization undertook. So let's talk a little bit about CREST's advocacy. I just wanted to put things in context a little bit. CREST had been, involved in various projects in Cuba when really the bombshell was announced in terms of the changes, and this was in November, has since that time has been extremely involved in coordinating travel industry partners, including Holbrook and other travel providers and educational institutions and scholars and attorneys, trying to, if you will, ask questions and engage the State Department as an industry to try and have a voice in this process. And I would also mention Respect is another organization out there. Many of you, may have heard of providers such as Mar Azul and others that have been focused exclusively on Cuba for many decades, and they have created another network as well called Respect, Responsible and Ethical Travel to Cuba. And so these are organizations that we've all been sort of working together to try and get the latest and greatest information and to have a voice, as I said. And we've also, we'll share with you at the end of the presentation a bit of a toolkit, which is just a sort of how to, in terms of getting, if you're interested in being a part of the advocacy process to, keep the normalization of U.S.-Cuba relations going, we'd love for you to join that process and join that advocacy work in your own communities. So I'd like to just mention very briefly, Cuba's a country that we've been working in since professionally since 2000. My first trip was in 1998, and I can't emphasize enough what a tremendous opportunity it is for the majority of the audiences that we work with, whether that's a natural history or an educational audience. Cuba is a place where students, naturalists, birders, you name it, really, there's just tremendous opportunities from a natural history perspective. Cuba's endemic species and endemism as a whole is amazing. Cuba's state of conservation, especially relative to other Caribbean nations, is amazing, and just the impacts that the embargo and the political relationship between the U.S. and Cuba play out in a whole series of ways that are something that we really encourage people to see for themselves and really enter the dialogue. As said before, the regulations governing travel to Cuba are complex. For the most part, we're going to focus on the part that is the changes in the actual OFAC policies, which is OFAC is an office that is under the U.S. Department of Treasury. So we'll talk specifically about those changes, and just have a chance to go into those and hopefully demystify some of that for you. So jumping right in here, the specific regulation, there's sort of two. I wanted to emphasize that there's sort of two separate issues. One are the OFAC regulations from the Department of Treasury, and the other, it relates to the State Department travel advisory. So just to separate those two, they're somewhat confusing because the policy changes and changes on the travel advisory sort of came in cascading, a frequency, and sometimes it's easy to get those two issues confused. But let's delve now into the OFAC regulations. On November 9th, the Trump administration enacted the new OFAC policy. They had actually made an announcement in June that they were going to do that, but it was made official and published, etc., submitted to the registry on November 9th and became effective as of that date. So let's talk about some of the similarities. There are still 12 general license categories for legal travel to Cuba. Those are listed here. And general licenses are defined as those that do not require the application for any specific license. So there's nothing that you have to submit in advance. You're essentially in some way, signing an affidavit before you travel that you qualify for one of those 12, and that is essentially your license. It's the same. The next point here is that each licensed traveler must retain records for 5 years, pertaining to their travel. And just for the most part, these license categories haven't changed substantially. Let's talk about what has changed here. So the people-to-people exchanges, people-to-people travel is essentially, defined as travel that is about civic engagement, that has a full-time schedule of activities, that has meaningful engagements with the Cuban people, and does not have a preponderance of engagements with high-level Cuban government officials and Communist Party officials. So that is the same. The definition of people-to-people exchange travel has pretty much remained the same. Now let's talk about some important differences here. And these are in some way a parsing of words, and so it can be a little confusing. But one of the things that the Trump administration has done is that they are no longer allowing people-to-people travel to be self-directed. It has to be, once again, as it was in the past, under a U.S. Organization that is subject to U.S. Jurisdiction, and it has to be sponsored by that organization. And a representative of that organization must accompany each group or party in order to ensure that the license requirements are met. So let's, moving on to the next slide. Holbrooke For example, and it doesn't have to be a nonprofit organization. It just says a U.S. organization. So it could be a for-profit, a not-for-profit. It could be, many different types of organizations would qualify, but they need to be organizations that can be seen as legitimately sponsoring a people-to-people trip. If Holbrooke is the entity, there's a representative from the organization that is leading the trip from the U.S. Or, for example, if we were working with the Friends of the Library of X organization, there is the entity from Friends of the Library could be the leader, and we would have an agreement with that organization to ensure that the leader understands their responsibilities as a Holbrook representative leading the trip in the field. So let's go to individuals and families and couples, and how at this and I saw several questions submitted before the webinar about this topic. So families, individuals, and couples can still legally travel under the people-to-people category. However, there must be more than one person traveling. This is how we're defining a group. The itinerary must meet the criteria for this license category, and one person in the party must agree to act as the Holbrook representative. And there's a form that we have that that is essentially that agreement. Okay. There is another aspect of the Trump administration's OFAC policies that are relate to prohibited entities, and those are entities that are defined as having ties with the Cuban military, so those are essentially no longer able to receive direct payments from U.S. Travelers and organizations, and there is a list of those on the OFAC website, and we will be providing website links for anybody after the presentation who wants to have those. Mostly those are hotels, but there are also some agencies and other commercial entities. Moving on to why that direct transaction prohibition is essentially not applicable to most of the types of, say, groups and programs that we would provide. First of all, any transaction that was already in progress prior to the November 9th, 2017 deadline has been grandfathered in. So there are a number of trips that we've offered with hotels that are on the prohibited list that simply, they were already planned at the time that this was announced. So those don't count. But most importantly, and the biggest reason why this prohibition doesn't really constitute a limitation for our programs is that our payments actually go to an organization in Cuba that is not on the prohibited list, and therefore essentially exempt, because they are then making the payments. They don't constitute a direct payment, since we're working with a provider in Havana that is not on this prohibited list. And finally, though less relevant for us here in terms of at Holbrook, is there are license categories that are not even subject to this ban, including journalistic activities, official government business, etc. Moving on to the other part, that's sort of part two that I referenced, the State Department Travel Advisory System. It's really important to note that this was a big change for the State Department's warnings in general, and really had its impact for many destinations, not just Cuba. And I'm just going to briefly go into some of those changes, and then talk a little bit about how it's broadly interpreted, and then I'm going to toss the baton over to Rich, who's going to tell you first a little bit about CREST, but then specifically drill down into this issue of how this travel advisory system is affecting Cuba in a way that we'd like you to take it all in context. So very briefly, they've now decided that all all countries will be listed, ranked on level 1 to 4, and those levels are, you can read them there on the screen. Level 1 meaning exercise normal precaution, and so on and so forth. But level 3 is reconsider travel, and level 4 is essentially, do not travel there. So it escalates very quickly. And I'd like to just mention that the travel advisory system, interestingly, can vary by country and region. So, for instance, Mexico overall as a country is a level 2, but there are particular regions within the country that are 3 and even 4. This is a nuanced system that allows them to differentiate geographically. And there's also an additional information on reason for risk. And if a country is rated higher than a level 1, there are 7 reasons that are essentially categorized in letters, whether it's civil unrest, health, natural disaster, crime, etc. Cuba has been evaluated at a level 3, which is reconsider travel. And I will turn the baton over to Rich here, who is going to talk to you a little bit about that State Department travel warning for Cuba, and give you a much more nuanced explanation here.
Thank you very much, Andrea, for inviting me and for inviting CREST here today, and for that excellent backgrounder on where things stand right now. And first of all, CREST, or the Center for Responsible Travel, is a Washington, D.C. based nonprofit. We're focused on sustainable tourism. We assist governments, policymakers, tourism businesses, and international agencies in finding solutions to critical tourism issues like the one we're talking about today. And we do that through various means: research, field projects, publications, and consultancies among them. And in terms of how this advocacy got started, as Andrea already pointed out, back in 2014, when the normalization of relations began, it opened up some distinct travel possibilities to everyone that didn't exist before. And things were on the upgrade, if you will, for a while in terms of U.S. Visitors to that country. Starting in June 2017, President Trump made a pledge basically to roll back a lot of the Obama-era policies, and as Andrea already pointed out, those new rules, if you will, came into effect back in November. But let's go back to September 2017, where there started to be reports of U.S. Embassy employees, and actually more than 20 of them in Havana, coming down with mysterious health symptoms. I don't think I need to kind of rehash all the headlines back then, but there was a mention of quote-unquote sonic attacks happening. And because of that, in late September, the 29th, I think it was, the State Department reduced the embassy staff by 60%, and at the same time issued a travel warning, what was then called a travel warning, which confused a lot of people, because basically the message there was it's not safe for anybody, including civilians, if you will, to travel to Cuba. So in October, we CREST and about 24 other tour providers, educational travel organizations, and experts on Cuba put together this coalition because we thought we had to A, educate the general public, and B, protest these particular policies that we felt were unfair. And our message from the start was travel to Cuba is both safe and legal, as Andrea has already pointed out. Now, our initial steps, and these were going on as the policies continued to change. It was hard to even keep track after a while because it was happening so quickly. But initially, one of our group is Ocean Passages, and they had a 130-foot schooner going down to Cuba, and with gap year students on it. And this was something they'd been doing for years, and they met with members of Congress back then and let them know the educational nature of their trip, and also how important it is for people-to-people exchange between Cubans and Americans. So that we thought that was a great way to kick off how valuable travel to Cuba is. We followed up basically in November. Well, that's when the President Trump's new rules came down, but we followed up in the beginning of this year after the January 10th announcement of a new travel advisory system. 2 days later, a core group of us met with State Department employees, and we wanted to ask them specific questions about why is Cuba rated a 3, because at that point, there were no more reports of anybody being injured. There was nobody beyond the 24 people that had reported that. And we had inclinations that no civilians were being injured. So we came up with this idea and we did it in a formal letter first, and we've continued to do it since then, to say that this level 3 advisory is unfair because it covers the entire country when these so-called incidents happened only in Havana, only in parts of Havana, and therefore the whole of the country should not be under a health warning, which it still continues to be today. So what we were lobbying for then was to reduce it to at least a 2. And since then we've talked about among people in our group that we should also ask for a 1, because it's really, as Andrea has already pointed out, considered one of the safest travel destinations in the world. In terms of trying to get some data to back up what we'd heard anecdotally, we went on to do a survey. CREST did this back in late January. We collected the results and had more than a 25% response rate. 42 tour operators and educational travel companies responded. And as you can see on this slide, there were some truly key findings. The 33% decline in travelers from 25,000 in 2017 to 17,000 in 2018. These numbers are rounded. An 85% decline of bookings in the second half of 2017. And this is, of course, after President Trump announced that he was going to roll back the Obama-era policies. 85% predict fewer bookings in 2018. And perhaps most significantly, 100% of those who responded to our survey said that the people that they had sent to Cuba, that not one of them had reported any health symptoms similar to those from the embassy employees. And this is actually a combination of the 2 years, 2016, 2017. That was more than 43,000 travelers. Moving on to this month, which has been quite interesting. March 4th was the deadline for the State Department to decide whether or not they were going to restaff the embassy. And as probably most, if not all of you have heard, they decided on Friday that they were not going to restaff. And ahead of that, actually, we sent out a petition, and 39 tour operators and educational travel companies supported it and signed it. And it basically was a petition to the State Department to restaff the embassy and also reduce the advisory to at least a 2. Obviously, I mean, that's out there, but the State Department already made its decision. And they are not going to restaff, and they've basically said that they're going to have it at the level it has been, because that's enough to kind of run things the way they've been run for the last several months. Although those are not that staffing does not support a lot of what the United States and the Cuban government agreed should happen going forward. And so it creates a problem for everybody. And at the same time, it creates this idea that there's still a health problem in the whole of the country, if you will. So the problem with this, the biggest problem with this, is that there's a lot of confusion. That's why we're on this webinar today. A lot of confusion and a lot of misperception, if you will, in part created by the policies of the U.S. government right now. And we want to try and clear that up and let people know that it's still safe and legal, as Andrea has already pointed out, very legal under 12 categories to travel to the country. And I just want to emphasize before we go to Q&A that there has not been an incident reported since August of last year for anybody else within the embassy community, if you will, saying they've had any health problems. And there's been zero civilians reporting that. I will point out that there was a recent article, literally came out yesterday, and somebody who's a member of our coalition, Peter Kornblue, he's a journalist and host, traveled to Cuba. He has done that for several years. He came out with an excellent article, basically, that explains the whole health incident timeline and talks about why specifically it was geared toward, if these were indeed attacks, that it was geared towards specific intelligence community members, and it was never and has never been shown to be a problem for the general public. So we're trying to clear that up and move ahead with our next steps, which is to go back to the State Department and ask for more information and maybe get members of Congress to help us to petition the Trump administration and the State Department, if you will, to lower that advisory to where it should be, which is at least a 2 and really should be a 1 at this point. So that's it for me. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Great. So speaking about the toolkit and what you can do, and obviously for those that that have absorbed this information, maybe have already traveled, help us to spread the message that Cuba is still legal and correct the misinformation that's out there and still safe, very safe. Contacting newspapers, magazine reporters, bloggers, talk show hosts, really any group that you feel would be receptive to this message and help us get the word out and demystify this. And essentially, reiterating the points that, I think Rich did a great job of going over. Thank you so much. That, no one, that these were really largely deemed a diplomatic issue that really is not related to public safety for travelers. Private citizens have not been harmed, and the U.S. at this point is the only country in the world that restricts its citizens from traveling to Cuba, that groups of all sizes can still travel to Cuba under the people-to-people category. That individual travel to Cuba is still allowed in almost all the 12 general license categories. And the only issue is the self-directed, quote unquote, individual people-to-people exchanges that are not sponsored by a U.S. organization. That's really a small nuanced change. And what you can do, to promote travel, just remembering what an important source of revenue and source of research, collaboration, and many other types of collaboration that are so critical to the U.S.-Cuba relationship. Also, the benefits, as I've referenced. Flights at this point are quite plentiful. There has been some drawdown in flight schedules and gateways as a result of this, as you can imagine, with the downturn. However, there is still great connectivity, still regularly scheduled, carriers are going and the fares are inexpensive. So we certainly want to encourage you to consider travel to Cuba. This is a great time to go, and 18, 19, it's still an option for you. And for those of you out there that are, travel providers or have other roles or other hats, we certainly invite you to join the coalition and to do what you can to help us get this word out there. So with that, I will close and invite you to just submit lots of questions, and we look forward to fielding those now.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Andrea and Rich, for sharing your expertise and kind of helping decode some of these changes, some of the confusion and the misperception that we've had. I'll start out some of the questions that we've received. I'll direct to you, Andrea. And you touched a little bit on this during earlier in the presentation, but we did have a lot of people ask about traveling to Cuba either independently or as a small group. And as you said, individuals cannot necessarily go under a people-to-people license, but small groups, even as few as 2 people can go. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. So as long as an itinerary meets the people-to-people license category, travel license criteria, like full-time schedule of, engagement with the Cuban people, meaningful engagement with Cuban people, etc., as few as 2 people can go, so long as one of them is willing to be the Holbrook representative. And that means essentially ensuring that the trip is fulfilling those license criteria.
Okay. And do those small groups have to travel with a Cuban guide?
When it comes to, parties of 2 and much smaller parties, the guiding is not the same as it is with a group of a certain size, because there are just different dynamics of a trip with just 2 people. So for example, there might be a Cuban guide for part of the program, but there could be certain parts of an itinerary that don't require a guide. So the short answer is, I can't imagine a people-to-people program that we would organize that has no guide whatsoever, but there could be, for certain smaller parties, limited guide, some areas where a guide is not needed.
Okay, so I think that also plays into another question that we received. If someone travels on a group program, either with Holbrooke or with another organization, can they extend their stay past the organized tour and do sort of an extension either on their own or with a guide?
As long as they are willing to sign the form as a Holbrook representative, as long as it's more than 1 person, and as long as the itinerary of the extension meets the requirements, yes, that's possible.
Okay, thank you. We also talked a lot in the webinar about safety in Cuba. Rich shared some really detailed statistics and some really great information about sort of the safety, what the situation is like in Cuba and how safe it is. We have someone who submitted a question asking, with the decision not to staff the U.S. Embassy, how will that affect travelers?
Rich, do you want to field that?
Or? Sure. It shouldn't have any effect beyond what has been the case for the last 6 months. I mean, some of it is a little confusing as to what's going to happen in the future with that embassy. The wording from the State Department is very vague in terms of what they feel is necessary size of staff to keep things moving there. But basically what they were telling us with the last decision is that things will go on as they have for the past 6 months, which is unfortunate because, well, you can still travel under those categories that Andrea already discussed, but there's still going to be this advisory out there that's going to A, possibly scare people, and B, confuse people. So things have not changed, but we really feel strongly that moving this advisory level down to a 2, which would be a lot more palatable to most people, because that's exercise increased caution. I mean, even that's could be problematic. We think it should be at 1, exercise normal precautions, but down to a 2, and removing the scare, if you will, of the possible health problems, I think would be a huge barrier removed for people to feel comfortable going to Cuba. They should now, because we really believe this advisory misrepresents things. But we're not sure what's going to happen next in terms of decisions they might make, but it's still very safe and legal to travel.
Okay, thank you.
I'd also
Andrea,
like to just make one more point about that, which is that my understanding is that emergency services for U.S. citizens, such as a lost passport, something like that, will still be attended by this core staff. So this is not an issue.
Great. We also have someone who'd like to know what has changed in Cuba following Hurricane Irma. How has Cuba changed?
Before it, Rich.
I mean, all the things that I mentioned, except for the June announcement by President Trump that he rolled things back, they all happened after. For a very brief time, there was a travel warning because of the hurricane. It's my understanding, especially from people on the ground there, that it was a relatively quick recovery, and they were back and operating very quickly. But all the things that I mentioned before in terms of, at the end of September, reducing staff and issuing another travel warning, they all happened post-hurricane. So that's really what we're dealing with now. But it's my understanding that, they completely recovered from the hurricane.
Yes, that is the case. And as early as November, most of the resorts that were impacted along the northern coast were operational again. So, it really has recovered to the point where I would say it's no longer a factor in terms of itinerary and planning in the destination.
Great, thank you. We have a request to show the slide with the 12 OFAC licensed categories again. So we're going to just go back to that real quick. And we can just kind of review those again. Obviously, the people-to-people is the category, the educational, that we would, most of our programs travel under, but there are 12 categories that fall under that general license. So we're going to pull them up for you here. We also have a question, and I'll direct this to either Andrea or Rich. Are there any parts of the country that cannot be visited under the current regulations?
No.
Okay. And then going into a little bit more of some of the logistics, either for groups that are already traveling or considering travel. Can you use US-based credit cards in the country, or do you still need to take dollars and exchange them into CUCs?
The latter. The banking relations are still where they were, and therefore you cannot take credit cards unless they're drawn on non-U.S. banks, like European credit card or something like that. There's one bank that I believe is called Centennial. It's, I believe, based in Alabama, that it moved from Florida, but it does have, able to issue a credit card that can be used in Cuba, but it's so exceptional that for all intents and purposes, the answer is that cash is still the way to go, and converting that cash upon arrival is what's required.
Okay, thank you. Are there any changes or new restrictions to the goods that can be brought back to the U.S. from Cuba by travelers, or the value, the dollar amount, or any other restrictions?
Not to my knowledge. I don't believe that has been impacted, and that's still an unlimited amount of, for instance, cigars and rum, and there is no longer a certain dollar amount. That was an old regulation that has not been revived to my knowledge.
Okay. Either anecdotally or in your own personal experience, have either of you noticed a change in attitudes or a change in attitude from U.S. Customs regarding returning travelers? Do you feel like things are still kind of the same coming back, or has there been a change in attitude?
From what our participants are saying, we haven't had any notification of particular challenges of returning participants. So on my end, no, I can't say that I have felt that there's a difference in terms of returning parties.
Okay.
Rich, anything on your end, or?
I mean, just what I'm hearing anecdotally, and is that no, people who are returning are reporting that they loved their visit there and felt safe the whole time and had no problems with anything, and that they'd recommend to others to travel to Cuba and meet the Cuban people and see what it's all about.
Great. And then we have a few questions from people who are interested in traveling to Cuba. And Andrea, early on, you talked about some of the different types of travel that you can do to Cuba, whether your interest is in gardens or birding or natural history. Do you have any recommendations for specific places to go in Cuba based on interest?
Well, that could take all day. We certainly have lots of different favorite areas that we include. I think that the Zapata Swamp is an area that, from a natural history perspective, is one that is an absolute must. It's one of the most important estuaries in the Caribbean, and it's a great area for endemic birds, and we just love that area. We also love the Guanahatabibes Peninsula for natural history as well, which is over in the far western tip. We love Vinales, which is an area where, again, we have your pictures there, Lindsay, are of the Vinales area, and they're just so beautiful. This is Las Terrazas, which is a self-sustaining community. It's sort of en route to Vinales. Here we have the Tocororo. So we love, all that area. Western Cuba and Zapata Peninsula is gorgeous. There's some incredible coastal areas also off of Zapata for snorkeling and just the marine life in that area. That's great. Yeah, that map is good. And then over, farther east, we've been, of course, the Sierra del Escambray, which is around Cienfuegos and Trinidad, is a great area for exploring, sort of montane. And of course, culturally, it's just phenomenal. You know, Trinidad is a UNESCO World Heritage Site in Cienfuegos. There's a beautiful botanical garden and waterfalls outside of that area. And then over, farther west, east, we've been exploring Eastern Cuba, which is in a number of our programs, Baracoa and Alexander Humboldt National Park, just an absolute gem, probably the area with the highest level of endemism in the whole country. Santiago de Cuba, which is, an incredible, cultural, it's the birthplace of the revolution, but, it was also the first capital of Cuba, and the list just goes on and on, as you can see. So in the Sierra del Cristal and the Mayari, we just love the whole country, and love to explore that for all kinds of cultural and natural history delights.
Absolutely. Is there a best time of year or best month to travel to Cuba?
I think that particularly the eastern side does get slightly higher temperatures, and so fall and winter can be great times in general for Cuba, and also for migratory birds and other things. So fall and winter is a slightly cooler time, and certainly for eastern Cuba that might be something especially to keep in mind, and avoiding hurricane season. So essentially June through October, can be good, although the Cubans are quite prepared to deal with hurricanes, and are very, very responsive when it comes to, if there's a cancellation due to a hurricane. They are very reasonable, and to some degree make it so that travelers insurance is almost unnecessary, because they will absolutely respond if there's a problem that prevents travelers from coming due to a hurricane. So it's a great destination.
Absolutely. And then we also have someone who'd like to ask if we have programs where teachers can be leaders, so either student groups, our student groups allowed, I guess, and then or either that or professional development groups for teachers, educators.
Yes, Lindsay, I don't know that we have them on the website, but we certainly do have programs that are geared to educators and professional development. So we've done both of that in Cuba. And there's actually a specific license for secondary school student groups. We don't do a lot of that to Cuba for some reason. It's just been much more at the college and university level. But that is legal as well, and so is professional development programming as well. So.
Okay, great.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think we have time to wrap up with one more question. And then if there are any other additional questions that we didn't get to today, we can definitely address them in our follow-up, or feel free to reach out to us. We'll be sending out information with our contact information to kind of to continue the lines of communication if people would like to know more about Cuba. But I guess to wrap up, we talked in the presentation, again, Rich shared some statistics about the impact that these restrictions are having, that the decline of travelers has, there's been a great decline in travelers. They're experiencing just kind of a pullback of travel. So the question is for both Rich and for Andrea, how are these regulations impacting the Cuban people, and how does increased travel help the Cuban people?
So I will just say that we are hearing from our providers in Cuba, and the impact is deeply felt. So it's hard to to know that that they're undergoing that kind of economic stress and strain, and it is a difficult time in Cuba right now. And I mean, that's sort of always true. It is, it's vulnerable, but I think it's, it's especially true right now. I think that there was such a boom of U.S. travel, and some of their traditional travel providers, other countries that have sort of kept a steady flow, like Canada and Europe, not countries, but continents. So European business, Canadian business that have been the mainstays of Cuba travel were almost in some way pushed away to accommodate this, the very hot American market. And now with the American market falling out, some of the other relationships are not, as present, if you will, to have stepped into the breach. And so it's tough. It is a tough time in Cuba. That's what I would say.
Yeah, and I would just second that. I mean, anecdotally, we've heard in many cases, especially smaller private businesses that were set up to help accommodate the U.S. travel. They've seen a huge drop in people making use of their casa particulares and the paladeros, and even some hotels as well, and
Yes.
the Airbnb folks. So it's having an effect there. And I mean, to the second part of that question, I just think this is what this is all about. Americans should be able to, within reason, obviously travel wherever they want, and should be able to have these exchanges with another culture and with other people, and not to even mention the business doors that get opened by what was a normalization a few years ago. I think to kind of stem that tide causes a problem for everybody on both sides, and and it helps to strain relations. And even if they're strained among or between governments, if you will, they shouldn't be restrained between the peoples of those countries. And that's why we continue to advocate for travel to Cuba.
Very good point, Rich. Thank you. Yes.
Great. Thank you. Well, thank you so much to you, Andrea, and you, Rich, for joining us today and for sharing your expertise. This is such a timely and important topic. So we really appreciate you sharing your time with us.
Thank you very much.
And thanks to all of you for joining us. And we hope that we will be following up with not only the recording of this presentation, but with links to Peter Kornbluh's recent article and other links that might be interesting and informative to you on this topic, and some programs, links to programs that you know might be interesting for you. So we'll follow up with that.
Yes, we'll also send out the toolkit that was referenced earlier, as well as Andrea mentioned, some of the articles and links. So we'll be sending that out shortly. So with that, we'll conclude our webinar. Thank you again to everyone who joined us today, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.